that Massey College will be putting on the challenges and opportunities in Canada's north and the circumpolar world beyond. We are happy to partner with the Bill Graham Centre for Contemporary History, who has helped us put together this series, and we will be discussing Arctic governance, lessons from the Arctic. We will be looking at climate change, permafrost issues, northern foreign policy, northern defense policy, the Arctic Council, and issues such as the history and land claims development and Indigenous rights in our north. The Arctic has always been one of the priorities of Massey College, and over the next year, we look forward to bringing you a series of events which we hope will engage you, entice your questions, and make evident the importance of Canada's north and the people who live there. Enjoy the day.
Good afternoon. My name is Emily, and I am one of the co-editors for this book with Tom Axworthy and Sara French-Rooke. 5 years ago, today, in 2015, the three of us worked together at the Gordon Foundation and organized a conference at the Munk School called Regional Governments in International Affairs, Lessons from the Arctic. Back then, we noticed that much of the dialogue about circumpolar governance in the Arctic focused on how non-Arctic voices admitted as an observer to the Arctic Council, such as China and Mongolia, was shaping the face and policy landscape of the Arctic region. We organized in 2015 this conference to bring the attention back to those local and regional jurisdictions that work and live every day in the Arctic and govern the Arctic as their home. You will notice that today, this event is for a book that is titled almost the same as the name of the conference, Lessons from the Arctic, the Role of Regional Governments in International Affairs. Turning the conference into a book was really the brainchild of one of our conference participants, Terry Fenge, who sadly is no longer here with us today. He was an enthusiastic champion for the voice of Northerners, which anyone could tell by taking a quick glance at all the work that he did in the implementation of the Nunavut Agreement. The co-editors and I are immensely humbled to have had this opportunity to work on this book project in his memory. This book draws upon the insight of the conference panelists and a broader range of a total of 26 outstanding scholars and practitioners from across the circumpolar region. The topics in the book include Indigenous internationalism, federalism, paradiplomacy, global institution building, and a lot more. Details on how to purchase this book can be found on the Massey College website at the webpage for this event. Today at this book launch, we have with us three of the chapter authors of the book, Inuuteq Holm Olsen, William MacKay, and Susan Chatwood. Inuuteq Holm Olsen was one of our original conference participants, and he joins us here today as the Minister Plenipotentiary for Greenland at the Danish Embassy in Washington. He has extensive experience in advocating for Greenland's role in foreign affairs, and he really is pioneering this area as Greenland's first diplomatic representative at the Danish Embassy to the United States. William MacKay is the Deputy Minister of Executive and Intergovernmental Affairs and Secretary to the Cabinet at the Government of Nunavut. Bill is a lawyer by training and has truly an impressive amount of experience in government administration and legal advisory work. He works on issues such as Aboriginal land claims negotiations and environmental regulatory matters in both public and private sectors in Canada's north. Susan Chatwood is an associate professor at the University of Alberta in the School of Public Health. She was the executive and the scientific director of the Institute for Circumpolar Health Research and has worked a lot with northern stakeholders. Her many achievements in recognition for her career in improving health services in remote northern communities include receiving the Polar Medal last year and being a scholar in the Fulbright Arctic Initiative. We're delighted to have Inuuteq, William, and Susan join us here today to share some of their insights on the role of regional governments in Arctic in the Arctic today. Bill, Inuuteq, and Susan will briefly deliver their individual remarks, and Sara, who is one of our co-editors, will then begin a moderated discussion with the panelists. We will then open the floor to questions from you, the audience, and you may submit your questions to the right of this video on YouTube. We hope you enjoy this event, and I now turn this over to Inuuteq for his remarks.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I'm glad that we have reached a point where we actually have the book. It's been years in the making, but what an impressive result that you have achieved. And I mean, I think it's a must read if you want to get perspectives on issues and people that are not normally covered in the news, for example. But I mean, my focus, as being a representative of Greenland, is to explain, I think, in the book, and how our external affairs and interests have evolved and developed over the years. I mean, we started with the Home Rule, where we began to take over responsibilities in 1979, and I would argue that the actual act and the process leading up to it didn't really give a lot of thought to Greenland's foreign relations, because as being part of the Kingdom of Denmark, issues like security, defense, and foreign affairs are the responsibility of the Danish authorities, and it will continue to be so until at some point, where if people are to decide, or majority of people are to decide that we no longer want to be part of that kingdom. But experience has shown us that with the continued, I think, evolution of taking over responsibilities and powers, there's also an external side to it. It's evident that our most important industries, for example, fisheries. So over the years, we have developed a lot of fisheries-related agreements with other countries and in regional fisheries management organizations, and continue to be, active in those, because they are imperative to our, I think, existence and development as a country, as a people, as an economy. So those, I think, you can see in the early years of Home Rule that those have, been, I think, one of the key elements in our foreign affairs capacity. But at the same time, being a part of the Arctic, that's also I think, kind of a natural, area that we have developed our interest and relations, be it with Nunavut, but also in the creation of the Arctic Council. I remember when I graduated from university in 1996 and began my career with the government of Greenland in the Department of Foreign Affairs. I mean, I remember clearly, not being part of the actual negotiations, but watching from the sidelines, how the negotiation on the creation of the Arctic Council, were and handled. So it's, I think, natural for us to also take a keen interest in Arctic issues, and Arctic regional cooperation with the other Arctic nations. So we have over the years developed our capacities in foreign affairs, and slowly moved on, from those, besides only fisheries or marine mammal, natural resource management, to also other natural resources like mining and oil and gas development, but also trade, relations. We've been active in the UN, with Indigenous people's rights movement and development of that regime, and we continue, I think, to evolve as we develop our capacities in taking over more and more responsibilities. Now with the Self-Rule Act of 2009, that's a law that regulates the relationship between Greenland and Denmark. There's, and I was part of that process in negotiating the chapter on foreign affairs. And you can see in there, that we can open up representations in other countries, and I was actually the one who was chosen to open up the representation here in Washington, D.C. So I represent the government of Greenland in Washington, D.C., but also to Canada. I think that's also important to remember. So, and that's part of that same evolution, because we have had a representation in Brussels, to the EU since '92, and the next one was, DC, and now we have in Reykjavik, Iceland, and the parliament in the fall, the Greenland parliament will debate, the next opening of a representation in Asia, in Beijing. So so my main point is that, one of my main points is that you have to, even though you're part of a kingdom, if you don't speak up for yourself or represent your interests, nobody else will. So that's, I think, our lesson from Greenland, because of when you take over an area of responsibility, and govern that, there's a natural external factor to that you also have to take into consideration. So, and if you don't want to be ending up being a bystander, and let others take the decision, you really have to, step up yourself and, speak up for yourself and, and promote and defend your interest. Be it, in a regional issue or towards other countries where you have relations with. So, and as we continue, I think, the discourse on that, we are beginning also to address what we got as the democratic deficits, in regional decision-making processes. We, for example, looking at, why shouldn't we be the ones who represent, for example, the Kingdom of Denmark in the Arctic Council? I mean, Greenland is a natural Arctic, kind of country in that kingdom. So I think we will, as we develop go down this nation-making process, we will continue that, these efforts to continue to, take responsibilities for the actions that we would like to see, but also that we want to represent and defend. So I think, with those words, I think I'll give the floor to William.
All right, thank you, Inuuteq. I just thank you to Massey College and the Gordon Foundation for arranging in this discussion, which I think is a very important one for us to have, as Inuuteq mentioned, and the book highlights. Okay. As the book highlights quite well, the role of subnational or regional governments within the Arctic has often been overlooked or undermined in the Arctic, and this book, I think, gives us a bit of a framework as to how we can address that and identify the role that subnational governments should have in the Arctic. So, as been noted throughout the book, subnational governments today have varying roles of varying prominence within international Arctic affairs, and as Inuuteq mentioned, Greenland is kind of a leader in this in terms of taking the lead in international affairs for a subnational government. And I think that is a model that we're all trying to emulate. And indeed, in the book, Tony Pennicott, who is a former Yukon premier, notes that at least in North America, subnational governments are often thought of as an afterthought in terms of international affairs that Canada and the United States undertake. So I think subnational governments, as Inuuteq mentioned, need to step up and take a greater role and have their voice heard in international affairs in the Arctic. So for my piece in this book, I focused very much on looking at what territorial governments, particularly Nunavut, had focused on in their intergovernmental affairs and their international negotiations. And I think, as you'll note in the chapter that I gave for the book, the Nunavut, NWT, and the Yukon in their intergovernmental negotiations are very much focused on sort of bread and butter issues like infrastructure, economic development, and other areas that are trying to address the gap that the territories have with southern Canada, whereas at the international level, the federal government may be more focused on sovereignty or maritime issues, which often don't make the agenda of subnational governments in the Canadian Arctic. So, so if you, in the chapter, I did a review of the different agreements that Nunavut has entered into intergovernmentally, and it shows that health and economic development as well as infrastructure are by far the biggest priorities that Nunavut and indeed NWT and Yukon have identified in terms of areas they'd like to work together with the federal government and with other Arctic governments on. And I would say that's not surprising given the infrastructure gap in Nunavut. This gap exacerbates the socioeconomic differences in the Arctic, across the Arctic, because of the lack of infrastructure. They contribute to the socioeconomic differences. And there's two areas where that difference is particularly striking. So first of all, with respect to housing, Nunavut, for instance, 38% of the population lives in substandard housing, whereas in Canada it's 4%. And the other area, of course, is, and Susan can speak more about this, but is in terms of health outcomes and healthcare, access to healthcare. There's a real gap in the Arctic compared to southern Canada with respect to that. And I think this was particularly highlighted by COVID-19. So when the pandemic was declared and Canada as a whole started to react to the pandemic, Nunavut's first reaction was to put a ban on non-residents traveling to Yukon or to Nunavut, and Yukon and NWT did the same. Initially, the Nunavut, like the other two territories, required the residents to isolate at home for 14 days, but was quickly determined that that wasn't going to be a very viable option because of the housing crisis, and there wasn't really, for a large portion of the population, the ability to isolate at home. So the government of Nunavut put isolation hubs in the south, in hotels in the south, and had their residents stay in those isolation hubs for 14 days before returning to Nunavut. And so as of today, I think 4,200 people have stayed in those hubs. So this has been an extraordinary expense for the government, but it's been COVID out and arguably saved money in the long run if we prevent a large outbreak of COVID in Nunavut. So with respect to the intergovernmental side, I think that those realities, the lack of housing, the healthcare concerns, very much shaped our intergovernmental response to COVID. So there was recently a safe restart agreement concluded between all the provinces and territories and the federal government. And Nunavut in those negotiations was very much focused on getting funding for what was termed vulnerable populations. So funding for isolation and ability to protect vulnerable or isolated populations. So that was very much the focus of their intergovernmental negotiations. And the three territories themselves also engaged with the federal government to get specific northern funding to address the healthcare needs as well as the costs of isolation. So that agreement was also concluded between the federal government and three northern territories. And then the other area that was very much of a concern to the three territories during COVID was the lack of infrastructure and the reliance on airlines in terms of getting supplies into the territory. So when the three territories banned travel into those territories, that of course hit the revenues of the airlines very much, and the airlines had cut back dramatically on the number of flights going into those remote communities. So in order to ensure that those airlines could continue to operate and continue to offer service to those remote communities, the government of Nunavut took the extraordinary step of starting to fund the airlines to the tune of $2 million a week, and that continued for a number of months in order to ensure that those airlines were able to operate. So again, the gap in infrastructure in the response to COVID was evident in terms of Nunavut's intergovernmental response, and the funding for those for that airline support came partially from the government of Nunavut, but also from Transport Canada. So the government of Nunavut was engaged in intergovernmental negotiations with Transport Canada to try to address that airline issue. So I would say that overall, Nunavut's intergovernmental efforts during COVID have been reflective of its history of intergovernmental relations between other territories with the federal government and also internationally, and it's very much focused on the socioeconomic needs rather than these kind of broader Arctic issues that that often are focused on by the federal government and the United States and other Arctic states such as marine transport, sovereignty, and even to a lesser degree climate change. The territories obviously are very concerned with climate change, but it doesn't appear to be as big a part of their intergovernmental efforts as maybe infrastructure or healthcare is. So I think the COVID response in respect of all three territories does kind of highlight the different focus that territories have put on intergovernmental relations that were outlined in my chapter in the book. So with that, I'll leave it there and turn to Susan and for her remarks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was a nice background for some of the topics that I'm going to be talking about. And I'm coming to this, my background is nursing, and I worked for many years across the North, and then got more involved in research. And as an academic now, I've sort of had the privilege to take a step back and look at, some of the issues that we see emerging around the health disparities and inequities in the Arctic. And I was happy when I was asked to participate in this book, because often health has been a bit of a distant cousin to some of these more immediate policy discussions within Arctic regions and between governments. It's, I guess, from the research perspective, and the early health research began in the 50s, and it was a very biomedical approach. It was a lot of physicians who would travel to the region, and there was a number of biological studies that started throughout the Arctic and circumpolar comparisons, mainly focused on health and health outcomes within Inuit populations. And then in the 90s, there was a bit of a transition to more epidemiological studies and looking at, well, what is causing some of these different health outcomes within Arctic populations, and looking at determinants of health. And that went on for a number of decades. And just recently, in the last 10 years, we're seeing more of a focus on the health system and what is that system's response, and then bringing in more community-based models and recognizing Indigenous knowledge in terms of how we're looking at health and the system for health. And so some of the work that I did that was contributed for the chapter in the book was first thinking about how do we describe health in the Arctic and look at that. And then with that lens, what is a health system, or what is a system's response to health? And I think within circumpolar nations, a lot of the commonalities that have brought people together have been shared geographic challenges when delivering health services, the impacts of climate change, health equity or inequities that might be present, and the importance of Indigenous values as we approach health. And that's not only thinking about health as sort of an illness model, but looking at the broader lens on health. And globally, this has been done and described in terms of social and economic determinants of health. And World Health Organization and people such as Marmot have approached this looking at the impacts of early childhood environment and education and housing. And I think we've heard conversations within each of our countries when we talk about determinants of health. And in recent years, Inuit and First Nations have taken it further or more specific to their communities, and spoken about balance and the ability to have life control and self-determination and climate change as important determinants of health. So when we think about how a system is responding to that, if we're thinking only about the health system as the health center you might go to for care or the hospital, there's a lot of things that fall off the table in terms of an individual's wellness when you're situated in the Arctic. And we've seen in European regions, in the EU, and some of the Nordic countries, they're taking a much more broader lens on the system that impacts health. And this has been described as health system stewardship, which is some of the language that I use in the chapter. But essentially, it's looking at it's the governance and how all ministries and different governments come together to look at health and how your specific department, might impact health. And William was talking about COVID, and I think there's lots of examples right now we're seeing of how intergovernmental relationships and the ability to work together is important for within a health crisis in this case. But then we're also seeing things like diabetes or heart disease, where it's also important what perhaps wildlife departments might be doing in terms of the ability to hunt caribou and how that impacts diabetes. And so there's a need for us to have a broader systems lens, bringing people together to look at health. And that's some of what I talk about in the chapter, and looking at, commonalities and differences between places like Alaska, Canada, Norway, and Finland, and looking at sort of Nordic and North American system responses. And I think some of the big differences that we see is in the Nordic countries, there is that broader health in all policies approach that has been established. Some of that has come from the governance and organization in places like Finland, and where they take a very, very purposeful approach to health in all policies. And they that started in the 70s when they were addressing high rates of diabetes and heart disease within the nation, and realized that, ministries such as agriculture and education, in terms of, what kind of milk was being served in the schools, was it whole fat milk or 1%? And so they began to really look at this purposely in terms of how they approached health. And then also when they were chair of the EU, that was determined to be the theme of that year, was a health in all policies approach. So we see that also trickle through the EU and a number of documents that have been produced. So one thing that I've sort of been thinking about through the research is then how does that cycle back, and how does that health in all policies approach come back to the Arctic, and what are the strengths and what is unique, and looking at some of these unique determinants of health, such as self-determination or climate change. And when we look at health in all policies, the importance of Indigenous governments being at the table when we look at health and health systems, and designing responses that are going to promote community wellness. And you can begin to see how framing that governance and being purposeful about that gets the right people around the table to talk about health and wellness and promote wellness in the communities. And so I think I'll stop there, but just really wanted to emphasize that if we're taking a broader lens on health, and if we're including within that lens Indigenous lenses on what health and wellness is, how does that cycle back to the governance and how we're approaching that, and how can individual nations shift the organization of health systems, and then how can we work together and learn from one another as we're doing that, and then to continue learning through the process. And I'll pass it back to Sara now.
Thank you so much to all the presenters. My name is Sara French, and I am one of the co-editors of this book. And I currently work as a senior negotiator with Yukon government. Thank you so much for all the panelists for their wide-ranging comments. And I think there's a few common threads that we're all facing in our work today as we respond to the context of COVID in these northern regions. But I think one of the questions that persists nonetheless is how, in an era where governments are our federal governments and international governments are so distracted with COVID response, and we're often the only person in the room representing our organizations or our governments. What lessons do you have from your experience, Inuuteq and William, of how to punch above your weight in those situations and ensure that the voices of these regions, whose interests are sometimes different than their national governments, are heard in that forum when you're the only person in the room who's there to advocate for your government? What life lessons can you teach us about how to respond to those sort of situations?
I guess I can take that first. I think that's an issue that is, it faces the three territories specifically. There's so many forums that, international forums especially, that are of interest to subnational governments like the three territories. And it's a question of putting your resources in the right spot. So I think to answer your question specifically, how do you punch above your weight? I think what you have to do is be strategic. So go to meetings or go to forums that you are the most important for your government, or where your government's voice is going to be the most relevant, and prepare ahead of time. Talk to the other people that are going to be at the meeting and are going to be participating. Get to know them beforehand, let them know what your concerns are, try to get allies and champions that will push forward your agenda when you actually do get to those meetings. And I think, like I said before, target your interventions to those areas where you think you can get the most bang for your buck. That's what I would suggest.
Inuuteq,
Yeah.
your dual role as covering both Canada and the United States, and your position as representative?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to brag or appear, somewhat, I don't know, too important. But I mean, I would argue that we are punching above our weight. When you think about Greenland has 56,000 people, and the amount of attention. I mean, be it something that we work actively, to kind of promote, Greenland in various forums, or if it is, an incident like, like the president of the United States, making Greenland a headline, as it did, last August. But I think, it's a funny, I think it's an interesting case to in observing how different various subnational governments promote their interests, be it Alaska or the regional governments in Canada, or for that matter Greenland, because there are ways where we both interact with each other, but also interact with, I think, with those decision makers, be it parliament, think tanks, or the federal government in various countries, as well as in forums like the Arctic Council, where we actively also are promoting our interest. I think as subnational governments, I think the important aspect is that, I think especially from our point of view, is that if you're not doing that, don't expect others to know what your position or interests are in a certain issue.
Thank you. And if anyone in the audience watching has questions, they're able to put it into the YouTube comment bar, and we'll be able to address those. So please do send in those comments or questions if you have them. I think when we look back, as Emily had said, this book came out of a conference that happened in a very different context than the one we sit today. Back in 2015, it was not unusual for many of the panelists here to be jet setting to different Arctic countries for meetings in face. At that time, we had an Obama administration who was very interested in Indigenous issues and in climate change. And our context has changed in the last 5 years since we started thinking about the questions that we've written about in this publication. So I was wondering if the panelists could reflect on how the changes over the last 5 years have impacted your area of study or your work. Are the restrictions on travel creating more opportunities to get together because we're spending less time in airports and more time on Zoom talking to each other? Is it challenging the way that you're working with other governments and other organizations across the circumpolar Arctic? And how has the context of the changing U.S. administration and their approach to the North also changing the context of your work? So just trying to understand what's different from the last time we all got together and talked. And Inuuteq, if you'd like to respond first.
Sure, absolutely. No, I mean, what a change, we've been going through or living through the last couple of years, because, from my, I think, point of view, sitting here in Washington, D.C., definitely it's been a lot of changes. I think U.S. and United States, I think, waking up to the realities of what's going on in the Arctic, and, the U.S. has identified China as being one of the main challenges, and then it's looking at the Arctic, and in this case also Greenland, they just reopened their consulate in Nuuk, and then also they initiated what they call an economic package of $12 million to various sectors in be it tourism, mining, education. So I think we are seeing a new United States in the Arctic, also because of the Russian military activities, in its building up its bases in the Russian Arctic as well. What you mentioned of the Obama administration and its focus on Indigenous peoples and climate change and the environment, and that has changed over the last four years, to be much more, I think, security, national security based, and I think the U.S. is looking more, I think, inwards, in that, in the North American continent, so that has effects as well. And in terms of the new situation with the COVID, I think we are realizing how important connectivity is. The fact that we are be able to connect in Alberta and Nunavut, Greenland, and Ottawa, in this forum shows that that we should utilize, I think, these new possibilities that Skype, Zoom, and what have you, meetings often now, because we are able to reach a wider audience, but also connect without having to necessarily spend hours or days traveling back and forth. So I think that's my take on the new situation.
Anything to add from the other panelists? William?
Yeah, hi. I would say, obviously, there has been some pretty fundamental changes in the last 5 years. I mean, I know it was almost 5 years ago last month that all the Arctic officials, senior Arctic officials, gathered in Alaska, and actually President Obama came to that meeting and addressed us at the meeting. So there was a real interest in the Arctic and Arctic issues from the U.S. that hadn't really been there before, and there was a lot of promise coming out of that meeting that the U.S. would be more of a player in the Arctic. And I would say that, at least from our perspective, that's kind of dropped off in the last 5 years. The presence of the United States in Arctic affairs, or their interest in Arctic affairs. And I guess from Nunavut's point of view, I mean, obviously for Canada, the U.S. is an important partner, but for Nunavut, it's one of the only jurisdictions that doesn't actually have a border with the United States, and there's not a lot actually of trade with Nunavut and the United States directly anyway, or U.S. investment in Nunavut. So at least 5 years ago, that was something our government was working to change, and I had gone down to Washington with the premier of the time to talk to the embassy and the ambassador, the Canadian ambassador to the United States, to put together a forum or a strategy to increase U.S. investment and interest in Nunavut. But I think that's kind of fallen off the radar for a number of reasons. The U.S. is, like I said, less and less of a player in Nunavut as it is, I think, at least from my observations in the Arctic. So that's probably one of the biggest observations I would have in the last 5 years, is the absence of a U.S. voice on the Arctic. And I would note, though, as well, that China is still around and still interested in the Arctic. That hasn't changed, and they just actually bought a mining company with operations in Nunavut. So China, as it was then, is still now interested in investing in the Arctic in terms of, specifically in the mining sector, and they're still, looking to play a greater role in the Arctic. So that hasn't changed. In terms of the I guess you had mentioned, the ability to connect virtually like we're doing today. Obviously, Nunavut, like much of the Arctic, does have its challenges with connectivity. So that, I think, needs to be addressed before we can take full advantage of the ability to meet remotely like we are today. But that does open up new possibilities that I don't think we've explored as much as we probably should have in Nunavut. And I think probably Arctic-wide. I mean, if you look at the Arctic Council, basically it's come almost to a standstill in terms of they've had to cancel all of their in-person meetings. I mean, they have had some virtual meetings, but it's not, it doesn't appear to have the same level of activity as they did when meetings were in person, or at least not the prominence that it had before. So I think as a whole, the Arctic needs to, it would be good for it to take advantage of the possibilities that are present with the ability to meet remotely and to have less in-person meetings. I think in-person meetings are probably very valuable, but we could probably rely on them less going forward, and have those in-person meetings have more of an impact. So, for instance, in the Arctic Council, a lot of the working group work could be done virtually, I think, in the future, and then those actual in-person meetings that we had would be less often and probably more impactful. And you'd be able to get more involvement from different players that maybe aren't necessarily involved as much. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks. Susan, any comments to add?
Yeah, I think things have certainly changed significantly from the health research perspective, in terms of first, like what's being researched and then how that's happening. And I think for sure I'm based in Yellowknife anyway, so I've done things virtually at the U of A for a number of years, but you do see the inequities and the ability to access education being, accelerated, with the low bandwidth throughout northern regions, and who's able to participate at the university level and those types of things. So I think, following up on what others have said, the importance of addressing that in the Arctic is a big priority for a number of reasons. And then the other piece in terms of what we're researching and how that's changing is perhaps looking at some of these critical responses that have been happening as a result of COVID within the health system. And there's a couple things that we've seen happening is increase of virtual care, which again there's inequities in who's able to access virtual care, but that is happening globally and there's a shift there. So it's going to be important to look at that, what's been working, and then how does this can this apply in the Arctic, and how can care be improved within remote Arctic regions. And then the other thing that we're seeing happening in the Northwest Territories, for example, there's been a large unit created at a perhaps controversial price tag, but bringing together the number of departments that are involved in decision-making around COVID and a COVID response. And that has to do with some of the things that William mentioned already in terms of, providing safe isolation and engagement across a number of governments, both within the territorial government and outside of government, and how do you promote safe communities and in the time of a pandemic. But it's going to be important, number one, to be doing these things, but also be thoughtful about what you're doing and how can this apply to other health outcomes and other, the pandemics or high prevalence of diseases isn't uncommon in the Arctic. So how can we be applying some of these lessons going forward?
Thank you, Susan. I believe we had a question from the YouTube stream. This is coming from Timothy Wild. Will the long overdue attention of national governments to ecological issues serve to enhance or limit the influence and role of regional governments? Anyone want to take that one?
Sure, Sarah, I can take a first stab at that one. I think obviously, well, it'd be smart for national governments to take into account the views of subnational governments and Indigenous governments and Indigenous groups in terms of their response to the ecological crisis. So, and I think to a certain degree they have, especially Indigenous engagement, but I think there's more that can be learned from this, specifically from Indigenous people in the Arctic, about how to address the issues from climate change. For example, like the permafrost thawing, that's an issue that's specific to the Arctic. It's caused by climate change, caused by southern southern use of resources, and it'd be very much something that the people that live in the Arctic should be involved in determining how to address. So that's, I think, the first example that comes to mind, that you really can't address that permafrost thaw question without involving the residents of the Arctic.
Inuuteq?
No, yeah, I think it's an opportunity to enhance, the role of the subnational government. I mean, not only ecological issues, but I think environmental or any other issues as well, that are pertinent to address when it comes to the lack of development or lack of resources and social or health problems as well. But when we think about the ecological issues, I mean, I think the role of the Arctic Council is also important in this respect, because it's very kind of environment and ecological, and climate change driven regional government or governance system. But I think it's also important, as William said, the disconnect between what's going on or the impacts of climate change. I think it's important to continue to address that. The Arctic is reacting to what is being presented to in terms of increased carbon dioxide levels. So it's it's the industrial actions in countries that are far from the Arctic that are affecting the Arctic, and we are the ones who are dealing with the most severe changes. And I think it's often forgotten, you look at, images like melting sea ice or icebergs and what have you, and then you think, oh, we have to save the Arctic, but no, you should actually, do something else, that is far from the Arctic if you want to address, those kind of changes that we are experiencing in the Arctic. And then, take into account, our perspectives and our interest in solving this issue.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left and are coming to a close. So I think to circle back to the topics that's on everyone's mind in terms of COVID response, and we've talked to that a little bit in terms of how it's shaping how our governments are responding to that pandemic. And intergovernmental affairs is playing a huge role, of course, into how these small jurisdictions are responding. For example, here in Yukon, we have the context of 11 final and self-government agreements. Interestingly, unlike all the other final and self-government agreements across the country, those agreements do not, the Federal Emergencies Act does not trump the self-government powers related to emergencies in those provisions. So one of Yukon's challenges in responding in an intergovernmental way to this pandemic has been to recognize and prepare for that the Indigenous governments may choose to take a different response and how to encourage coordination across all the various levels of Indigenous governments with territorial action, with our federal partners, with our international partners. So I think it's really important when we're talking about the local context that we're understanding that intergovernmental also means with our Indigenous government partners. So I think as a final question to the panelists before I ask you to provide some concluding remarks, what are the other ways in which your governments, your organizations are seeing the pandemic affect your jurisdiction differently? What do you hope that others, when they look at how you're responding, understand about the context that may be different from anywhere else in the world? Susan, maybe you want to take a first stab at that?
Okay, well, I'm not a representative of any government in the territory, so wouldn't be speaking on that behalf. But I think in terms of global lessons and lesson learned, I mean, we've already discussed some of the intergovernmental and Indigenous government engagement and responses, and that's one piece of it. Another thing that stood out for me here is the rapid response that came from communities in terms of responding to COVID-19 and immediately community supports, be it food baskets or supporting people to get out on the land, and land-based responses for promoting social distancing and really applying community knowledge to those kinds of responses. And my understanding of that is coming from immediately you're hearing stories about the 1918 pandemic and the impacts of that influenza outbreak and the tragic outcomes that resulted here in the Arctic, and in the ways that knowledge is passed through the communities, those narratives and that experience is right here, right now, and people immediately knew what it meant, a pandemic, and what the impacts could be in Arctic communities. And my sense is there's been some really strong and innovative community responses, and it's that's all sort of happening now, and I think that's going to be important to both for governments to describe, for communities to be describing, and looking at that sort of within the research community and how we might use this for education moving forward.
Inuuteq?
Yeah, I think as Susan alluded to, I think people in the Arctic have gone through different epidemics throughout history, and I think there's I would argue, I think a much greater awareness of what epidemics or pandemics like the COVID can do to small societies, because we have lived through them. Look at the tuberculosis and the different flus. It's interesting, that people, I think, people are much more aware that they have to take, these different precautions, and been calling for, actions by the governments. And when it comes to Greenland, I think we also have to remember, that we have to look at the strength and weaknesses. I think it can be actually, those can actually be both, on the same token, because when we look at the onset of the pandemic, I mean, we were part of the we are part of the globalized, economy, as well as the transportation system. So we were able to close off, the transport, like also Nunavut did. But Greenland being an island, you also have islands within the island, because we have no road connections between towns and villages. So we were able to close off, for example, Nuuk, where we had the most cases from the rest of the country. And then, I think we were able to also develop our testing capacities, not only in Nuuk, but also in smaller towns. So we were able to open up, for travel. So I think, we had, as I said, we have to look at the weaknesses, because it would be a catastrophe if it came to a small village, for example, where there's no testing capabilities, and then it will take days to know the results. I think based upon those, you have to be able to take several actions to secure the health of those people that might be vulnerable to the COVID.
William?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I don't have too much more to add to that as to what I outlined originally in my opening comments, but I would highlight, I guess, one thing I think that we share across the Arctic is, because of the lack of infrastructure and maybe the less of a government presence in all of the communities, pandemics can typically cause a lot more damage, as Inuuteq said, if they do break out in a community with overcrowding and maybe not as good as access to healthcare as necessary. So I would highlight, I guess, that all of these communities rely on, probably more so than outside the Arctic, they rely on civil society, if you like, or community response to crises like this. So they, for instance, the school will serve a whole bunch of different purposes during a pandemic to allow for to deliver services within that, if there's no healthcare center, for instance, or we have the involvement of very close involvement of hamlets or hamlet councils or Indigenous groups within the community to assist with the response to the pandemic. So it's very much a whole community response rather than a government response alone. So I think that could be highlighted for people, and I think that's the case across the Arctic in these small communities, that it's more of a, it relies on community volunteers and community responses to be able to address the crises. Thank you.
Thanks, and we're coming to a close here. Perhaps in reverse order of your speaking order, if there's any last thoughts or comments that any of the speakers would like to give. I'll start with you, Susan.
Yeah, I think the only thing I wanted to add as a recommended resource, if people wanted to review more information about how COVID has been unfolding in the Arctic, is there was a recent briefing note for the senior Arctic officials of the Arctic Council that was published, and that provides a very good overview of some of the historical context, and then as well responses that have been ongoing. But yeah, thank you very much. It's been wonderful using this new approach and presenting. Thank you.
Thank you. William, anything more from you?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Not too much. I just like to thank everybody for organizing this and contributing to the book. As I said at the beginning, I think this is an overlooked area of governance for the Arctic, the role of subnational governments, and I just thank everybody for the opportunity for allowing me to submit an article and to appear on this panel today. Thank you.
Thanks. Inuuteq?
Also, thank you from my side, to my co-panelists, but also to, Tom, you, Sarah, as well as Emily for all the work you did in assembling, I think, an important, as the title says, lessons from the Arctic. So I think there's these are important voices that should be heard and should continue to be heard, in whatever issue that we are discussing. So thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, those of you watching, the panelists for being with us, to my fellow co-editors, Tom and Emily, as well as to Mosaic Press and Howard Astor there for helping to make this project a reality. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.